The first scan came back wrong, and I knew what that meant before I finished reading it. I had been in the Situation Room aboard Reclamation Platform, enduring Ledger for 11 hours when the fold event hit. We'd tracked the resonance signature building for 6 days, a gravitational harmonics pattern that matched the theoretical models in Archive Set 14 almost precisely. Almost. The discrepancy of 0.003% in the approach vector was the part that had kept me awake the night before, making notes in the margins of documents that were older than most civilizations. Now the fold event was real and the fleet was real, and the first scan was telling me the lead vessel was just under 4 kilometers long, flanked by 8 escort-class ships that our instruments classified as heavy combat configuration. 72,000 years of preparation, and my first thought was, I hope the resonance counters are calibrated. My name is Marin Solis. My official title in the dry language of the Planetary Coordination Office is Senior Liaison Threshold Integration Division. What that means in practice is that I am the person who stands between two kinds of history, the kind recorded in the public archives that anyone can read, and the kind kept in Archive Set 14, which very few people know exists and fewer still are cleared to open. For the last 9 years I have lived on the Enduring Ledger, a platform that does not appear on civilian navigation charts, in a high stable orbit position that was chosen 72,000 years ago by people who understood, with extraordinary precision, where the Keth Dominion would emerge when it came back. They always knew the Dominion would come back. That was the entire point. Let me tell you what I knew about the Keth before their fold event cracked the sky 400 kilometers above the North Atlantic. 72,000 years ago, the Keth Dominion was the dominant expansionary civilization in this galactic arm. They did not conquer in the way most people imagine: massed fleets, planetary bombardment, occupation. Their method was older and quieter than that. They seeded. They would identify a pre-sapient or early sapient species with biological potential they found useful, introduce a sequence of what their records called latency accelerants, subtle interventions in the target population's development, and then leave. They would come back in their own time when the asset had matured. They would collect what they had grown. Earth was one of their seeding projects. Humanity did not know this for a long time. The knowledge emerged slowly, in fragments, the way all true history does, a recovered artifact here, a translated signal there, an anomaly in the fossil record that kept not making sense until someone looked at it from a different angle. The first coherent picture came together roughly 40,000 years ago, assembled by a coalition of researchers working under what was then called the Deep Ancestry Project. They brought their findings to the Coordination Council in a presentation that lasted 3 days. The Council's response when the 3 days were over was not panic. It was not denial. The Coordinator General of the time, a woman named Thessaly Vorn, looked at the assembled evidence and asked one question. She said, "When do we expect them back?" The answer the researchers gave was, "Not for another 30,000 years, minimum." Keth seeding cycles ran long. The Dominion was patient. It planted and walked away and did not return until it was confident the asset had had time to mature to full utility. Thessaly Vorn sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Then we have 30,000 years to decide what we are." That sentence is in Archive Set 14. I have read it hundreds of times. It still moves something in me when I do. What followed was the longest and most sustained act of institutional will in human history. The Threshold program was not a military project. It was not, strictly speaking, a scientific one. It was both of those things and something harder to name, a civilizational decision to understand, and then to master, and then to turn back to source, the thing the Keth had started in us. The latency accelerants had done something real. That much was undeniable. The Deep Ancestry researchers had documented the effects across the fossil record with uncomfortable precision. The keth had reached into the early human genome and left a door ajar. What was on the other side of that door was what 40,000 years of the threshold program had been quietly, methodically exploring. I will not use the word psychic. It is not precise enough. What the threshold program developed over those 40 millennia was a rigorous, replicable, institutionalized framework for a category of human capacity that the keth had apparently intended to harvest as a resource. The ability to perceive coherent signal structures in what registers as noise to unaugmented senses. The ability to project those structures outward with enough precision to interact with engineered systems keyed to that frequency. The ability, when the practitioners were organized at scale and trained to concert pitch, to do things to keth-origin technology that the keth had designed only their own handlers to do. That was the part that had taken the longest to develop. Not the perception, not the projection, the concert pitch. Teaching 10,000 trained threshold practitioners distributed across Earth and its orbital infrastructure to act as a single coherent instrument that had taken generations. It had failed and been rebuilt and failed again. It had lost funding 14 times in 40,000 years and been reinstated 14 times because there was always, eventually, someone who read the archive and understood what was coming. We were ready because we had never once, in 40,000 years of continuous institutional memory, allowed ourselves to forget that we needed to be. That was what I was thinking about when the fold event opened and the keth fleet came through. The resonance alarm was already sounding when Commander Aldrich Voss came through the Situation Room door. He was the platform's senior defense coordinator, and he moved like a man who had run every drill so many times that the alarm itself was almost a comfort, a familiar signal that the thing you had been preparing for had finally arrived, and was therefore no longer a hypothetical. "Solly's," he said, "not a question, just my name establishing that I was where I was supposed to be." "I'm here," I said. "First scan, 4.1 kilometers on the lead vessel, 8 escorts, combat configuration." He took the scan summary from the secondary terminal and read it without speaking. Outside the reinforced viewports, angled at 60 degrees to reduce debris risk, not for the view, though the view was something, I could see the fold event still dissipating. Keth folds left a characteristic afterglow, a spreading disk of violet-white ionized plasma that our instruments had learned to read like a text. The disk was 340 kilometers across and still expanding. That told us something about the energy class of the fold generator aboard the lead vessel. It was not a standard Dominion survey ship. It was something heavier. "They brought a flagship," I said. "Looks like it." Voss set the scan summary down. "Threshold status. Platform arrays online as of 4 minutes ago. Ground stations acknowledge and are standing by. Concert coordinator confirms 5,100 practitioners in active ready state." I paused. "That's more than we need. It's about twice what we need actually." Voss didn't smile exactly, but something in his jaw eased. "Good. What's the Dominion doing?" "Holding position. No approach vector yet. They're scanning." That was expected. The keth Dominion, according to the cultural analysis in Archive Set 14, did not move until they had a complete read on what they were moving toward. They were not impulsive. They were not reckless. They were patient in the way that a civilization which had been running a 72,000-year asset development cycle was patient, which is to say, congenitally, constitutionally, as a matter of identity. They would scan for as long as they needed to scan. They would build the picture. They would update their models, and when their models told them what they expected to find, they would move. The interesting question was what their models were going to tell them. From where they were sitting, 400 kilometers up, Earth was not immediately identifiable as the same planet they had left. The megacity infrastructure of the northern continental shelf extended from the eastern seaboard to the far edge of what had been the Great Central Plains. a continuous built environment that from orbital altitude registered as a single unified organism rather than a collection of cities. The Veil Array, a passive-active sensor lattice spread across the upper atmosphere, was invisible to standard keth frequency scans. The orbital lattice, the ring of defense platforms that circled Earth in 4 interlocking orbital planes, had gone to passive mode the moment the fold event began, which meant it was currently not emitting anything the Dominion's instruments would classify as military hardware. It looked, on their scans, like unusually dense orbital infrastructure of an industrial or commercial character. 712 heavy warships were currently positioned within the lattice, all running minimal emission profiles. They were not hiding. They were simply not announcing themselves. There is a difference. I had a feed from the lattice's passive optical array, and I pulled it up on the secondary display. The lead keth vessel, the flagship, was a shape I recognized from the archive's imaging reconstruction files. Long and low profile, like a blade lying flat, with 4 articulated drive pylons swept back at an angle that made it look perpetually in motion even at rest. The escorts were shorter, denser, studded with weapons hardpoints along the ventral hull. The whole fleet had an appearance I could only describe as proprietary, businesslike. This was not an invasion fleet in the way that word usually conjures. There were no drop troops, no planetary bombardment platforms, no terraforming ordnance. This was a collection unit. They had come to pick up something they owned, or something they believed they owned. The first communication came 47 minutes after the fold event. It was not in any language currently spoken on Earth, but Archive Set 14 contained a full keth linguistic matrix, a translation protocols that had been refined over 1,200 years by the Coordination Office's Xenolinguistics Division. The message came through on the frequency band the keth had historically used for asset management communications, which told us immediately that they knew exactly what they were here for, and that they expected the planet below to understand at some level what they were saying, because that was how asset management worked. You built the asset to respond to the call. The communication, translated, read as follows. Keth Dominion Proprietary Recovery Vessel Ascendant Yield, authorized under Seeding Charter 14.7 Covenant, notifying Asset World Designation TERTIUS that Reclamation Protocol is now initiated. Asset Inventory Confirmation is requested. Compliance is expected. Duration of the compliance window, 96 standard keth hours. Voss read the translation over my shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Asset Inventory Confirmation, he said. Yes. They want us to present ourselves for counting. That's what the seeding charter calls for. The asset world confirms the yield has matured, the recovery vessel verifies the yield meets specification, and then the yield is transferred. He was quiet again for a longer moment. What's the yield specification for a keth seeding project of this class? I had read this part of the archive so many times I could say it without checking. Complete transfer of the highest functioning latency accelerant positive individuals in the asset population, estimated at between 0.3 and 0.8% of total population, depending on maturation. The remainder of the population would be classified as harvest complete, and the asset world reclassified as a keth administrative zone. The situation room was very quiet. Voss looked at the display showing the fleet. Then he looked at me. Write the response, he said. I had been writing it in my head for 9 years. The response we sent was also on the historical asset management frequency in the keth linguistic matrix. It read, Coordination Office of Earth, Threshold Integration Division, acknowledges receipt of Reclamation Protocol notification from Proprietary Recovery Vessel Ascendant Yield. Compliance window acknowledged. Earth is prepared to discuss the terms of Charter 14.7 Covenant. We invite the authorized keth representative to review updated asset inventory parameters before proceeding. Please advise on your preferred communication format. There was nothing aggressive in the wording, nothing defiant. This was important. The archive's analysis of keth communication protocols was unambiguous on the point. The Dominion responded poorly to defiance and extremely well to the appearance of compliance followed by procedural obstruction. They were an old, bureaucratic civilization. They respected process. They were, in some ways, easier to manage than you might expect precisely because they had very clear ideas about how things were supposed to go. You could use that. The response from Ascendant Yield came back in 11 minutes. They would accept a direct communication link with the Threshold Integration Division's senior authorized representative. That was me. I sat down at the primary communication station and put on the headset and looked at the display, which was showing me a live feed of the approaching communication drone, a small keth atmospheric insertion probe that was dropping through the veil array at a leisurely pace, broadcasting its asset management credentials on every appropriate frequency. It was authorized to enter orbital space. It was not authorized to enter the lattice perimeter without our consent. It stopped at the edge of the lattice and held position, waiting. "Let it through," I said. "Confirmed," said the lattice watch officer over the comm. The drone came through the lattice gap we opened for it and took up a stable position 4 kilometers off the enduring ledger's port side. Its communication array lit up and the signal connected, and I was, for the first time, looking at a keth. It took a moment to absorb. The keth communications representative, its title translated roughly as charter executor, was not what I had imagined from the archive's reconstructed images. The archive was good, but it was built from artifacts and signal intercepts, and a handful of biological samples recovered from sites that the keth had occupied tens of thousands of years ago. What I was looking at now was living. The charter executor was tall and pale-plated, its exterior a layered arrangement of chitinous segments that gave it the appearance of something assembled rather than grown. Its head was a flattened oval, and its eyes, 6 of them, arrayed in 2 vertical columns, were a deep amber that seemed to contain light rather than reflect it. It wore a formal garment of a material I did not recognize, something between fabric and shell, and its posture was the posture of an entity that had done this procedure 100 times and expected this instance to run like all the others. It looked at me through the display, and its vocal apparatus produced a sequence of tones that the translation system rendered as, "You are the compliance coordinator for designation TERTIUS. I am the senior liaison for the Threshold Integration Division," I said. "My name is Marin Solis. I am authorized to speak on behalf of the Coordination Office of Earth." A pause. The designation TERTIUS refers to this asset world. We do not use local naming conventions in charter documentation. "I understand. I am authorized to speak on behalf of the asset world you are designating TERTIUS." Another pause, slightly longer. The charter executor consulted something outside my visual field. "Your compliance window has begun. We require asset inventory confirmation. This is the initial procedural step." "Yes," I said. "I understand the procedure. Before we move to inventory confirmation, I need to notify you that the asset parameters for designation TERTIUS have undergone significant revision since the charter was last updated. This revision triggers Article 7 of the keth Proprietary Seeding Charter Standard Protocols, which requires a bilateral parameter review before inventory transfer can proceed." The charter executor was still for a long moment. Then, "Article 7 applies only when the asset maturation has resulted in a departure from specification of greater than 15% along any assessed dimension." "Yes," I said, "that is the threshold." Designation TERTIUS is a standard tier 4 latency accelerant project. Historical assessment, projected a maturation yield of between 0.3 and 0.8% of total population, with standard capacity parameters. Yes, I have the charter documentation. The original projection is consistent with what you've described. Then you are confirming that the yield meets specification. I looked at the charter executor's amber eyes. All 6 of them, and I thought about the 40,000 years of archive that sat behind the answer I was about to give. I thought about Thessaly Vaughan and the question she had asked. I thought about the 14 funding crises and the 14 reinstatements and the generations of practitioners who had spent their lives building toward a concert pitch they would never personally hear. I thought about the resonance counters I had been worried about that morning, which were now reading clean. No, I said. I am not confirming that the yield meets specification. I am triggering Article 7. The departure from specification on designation TERTIUS is significantly greater than 15% along every assessed dimension. I am formally requesting that you transmit the bilateral review request to Fleet Commander Ascendant Yield and hold reclamation protocol pending their response. The charter executor was still for so long that I thought the communication link might have dropped. Then it said, very precisely, "What is the departure figure you are claiming?" "We can discuss the precise quantification during the bilateral review," I said. "But to give you a preliminary sense, the standard Tier 4 projection anticipated a 0.3 to 0.8% yield at standard capacity parameters. The actual maturation on designation TERTIUS has resulted in approximately 16% of the total population demonstrating active latency accelerant expression, at capacity levels that exceed the Tier 4 standard parameters by a factor that my team is still calculating, but which is, conservatively, somewhere between 40 and 60 times the projected maximum." The charter executor looked at me. It did not blink. The keth eye structure did not work that way, but something changed in the arrangement of those amber eyes. Something recalibrated. I had read enough about keth nonverbal communication in the archive to know what I was looking at. An entity that had walked into what it believed was a routine collection call, realizing, in real time, that the numbers did not add up. "That figure," it said carefully, "would imply." "Yes," I said. "I know what it implies. That is why I am requesting the bilateral review. Article 7 is very clear that when the parameter departure is of this magnitude, the charter terms require renegotiation, not simple compliance. I am asking you to honor your own protocols." There was a longer pause this time. Then the charter executor said, "I will transmit your request to the fleet commander. Communication suspended pending response." The link went dark. Voss let out a breath that he had clearly been holding for the entire exchange. 40 to 60 times, he said. "Conservative estimate," I said. The concert coordinator's last figure was closer to 80, but I didn't want to lead with that. "Probably wise." He looked at the display showing the keth fleet, still motionless at 400 kilometers. "How long before they respond?" "Unknown. The charter review process has never been triggered at this scale before. There's no precedent in the keth records we have access to. They will need to convene. And while they're convening, we wait and we hold the concert pitch." The concert coordinator's name was Rayan Albrecht, and I had worked with him for 6 years. He was a threshold practitioner himself, one of the highest rated in the current generation, and he ran the global coordination network from a dedicated facility in the mountain infrastructure of the continental spine, 3 kilometers underground, with redundant communication links to every regional hub on the planet. When I contacted him through the secure channel to update him on the exchange with the charter executor, he listened without interrupting and then said, "They're going to want a demonstration." "I know," I said. "How long can you hold the pitch?" "At current practitioner load, indefinitely. We're not straining. We're not even at the level we run the standard integration exercises." That was important. The keth, when they came back to do a yield assessment, would be looking for signs of strain. A population straining to perform at the edge of its capacity was one thing. A population performing at the edge of its capacity and not straining was something categorically different. The Threshold program had spent 40,000 years teaching practitioners not just to be capable, but to make capability look effortless. Mastery, not performance. The difference mattered. "Stay at pitch," I said. "I'll let you know when they come back." The 9 hours between the communication going dark and the fleet commander's arrival gave me time to do what I had not had time to do since the Fold event: walk through the Enduring Ledger's concert deck. The platform had 12 concert arrays built into its lower structure, each one a hardened chamber fitted with Threshold integration hardware that had taken 3 generations to design and 4 to refine. The arrays were not the source of the practitioner's capacity. That was biological, developed, a thing that lived in trained human minds. But they were the amplification and synchronization infrastructure that allowed individual practitioners to act in concert. A single practitioner at full expression was, on the assessment battery's terms, extraordinary. 5,000 practitioners in synchronized concert were something the keth's measurement systems had not been built to properly record. I walked through concert array 7, which was staffed by a rotation of 40 practitioners sitting in the integration chairs with their eyes closed, and their attention turned outward in the direction that Threshold work went, which was not a compass direction, but which the practitioners had described, over 40,000 years of trying to put it into language, as something like inward-outward simultaneously, a collapse of the distance between intention and effect. They looked peaceful. That was always the thing that struck me when I watched practitioners at pitch, not the effort, which was real, but the quality of the effort. 40,000 years of cultivation had produced people for whom this was not a strain. It was a practice. It was something they did the way a musician plays an instrument they have known since childhood. Present, focused, and essentially comfortable in their own competence. The array supervisor, a woman named Holt, fell in beside me as I walked. "They're holding beautifully," she said quietly. "No variance in the concert thread. The pitch has been stable since 3 hours before the Fold event. Rayan had us warm up early." "He always does," I said. "He ran every possible scenario in the 6 days we were tracking the resonance signature. He had us run a population-scale synchronization drill 2 days ago, full concert, 4,800 practitioners. Called it a routine integration exercise in the scheduling system." She paused. "I don't think anyone thought it was routine." "No," I said, "but it was important to do it." "The results were clean," Holt said. "Cleaner than any drill we've run in the last 3 years. I think people knew. I think it focused them." That was the thing about preparation at scale. You could not fully hide it from the people doing the preparing, and you did not need to. The practitioners on the Enduring Ledger and in the ground stations, and in the regional hubs across the planet had spent their careers working towards something that everyone in the Threshold program understood, in a general way, was not a drill. They had held to the practice through the ordinary texture of decades, the daily training, the regular assessments, the concert exercises that were real exercises and also something more than exercises. When the Fold event came, they had not needed to be told what it meant. They had simply moved to ready state and held. That was what 40,000 years of continuous institutional memory looked like when it worked. Not a sudden mobilization, a quiet shift in the quality of readiness that was already there. They came back in 4 hours and 19 minutes. The fleet commander of Ascendant Yield did not use the drone. The fleet commander came in person, or rather, in the communication equivalent of person, a full holographic projection that filled the forward section of the Enduring Ledger's situation room to a height of approximately 3 meters. The fleet commander was a different order of being than the charter executor. Older, heavier plated. The chitin on its thorax was marked with what the archive identified as senior command insignia, long horizontal scoring patterns that recorded significant acts in a keth officer's service history. There were many scores. This was not an entity that had spent its career behind a desk. It looked at me the way something looks at an unexpected variable, in a calculation it believed it had already completed. Coordinator Solis, it said. Its translator was better than the charter executors had been. The tonal rendering was closer to natural speech. I am Fleet Commander Varath Sond of the Ascendant Yield. I have reviewed your Article 7 notification. I have reviewed the preliminary parameter figures your liaison transmitted with it. I have some questions. Of course, I said, I am prepared to answer them. Your claim is that 16% of this world's population shows active latency accelerant expression. Confirmed. The original seeding protocol for this world was a Tier 4 intervention. Tier 4 seedings typically yield between 0.3 and 1% active expression. The gap between your claim and the projected yield is not within any range I have encountered in 30 years of recovery operations. I understand, I said. It is outside any range in your operational precedent because nothing like this has occurred before within the Dominion's asset portfolio, to our knowledge. We believe the explanation is twofold. First, the latency accelerant introduction, for reasons that are still being analyzed, interacted with our baseline genome in ways that produced a cascading expression effect across generations rather than a static yield. Second, and more significantly, designation TERTIUS has been engaged in active threshold cultivation for approximately 40,000 years. What began as a latent natural potential has been deliberately developed into a structured institutional capacity. Varath Sond was still deliberately developed. Yes, we knew the seeding had occurred. We discovered the charter documentation in our deep archaeological record. We understood what the Dominion would eventually return to claim. We made a decision to understand what had been done to us before anyone came to collect it. Another long stillness. You found the charter documents. 40,000 years ago, roughly. The archive has been maintained continuously since then. And you developed the expressed capacity intentionally. Over 40,000 years, yes, with significant institutional investment and continuity. The threshold program is not an anomaly or a natural variance. It is a cultivated, organized, scaled response to what we found in the charter. It is the product of a civilization that remembered what was done to it and prepared accordingly. The situation room was very quiet. Varath Sond's scoring-marked thorax rose and fell, their equivalent of a breath, or what the archive said was their equivalent. Then it said, "You are claiming this under Article 7 as a parameter departure." I am. Article 7 requires that when the departure exceeds specification by more than 15% on any assessed dimension, the charter terms are suspended pending renegotiation. Our departure exceeds specification by thousands of percent on every assessed dimension. Under Article 7, the reclamation protocol is not merely suspended. It is void pending new charter negotiation. Article 7 was drafted for yield overperformance scenarios, where the overperformance was a matter of degree, Varath Sond said. Not for scenarios where the asset world has independently classified itself as a non-asset entity. With respect, Fleet Commander, Article 7 makes no distinction between sources of departure. It sets a numerical threshold. We meet it. The Article's language does not require us to demonstrate that the overperformance was accidental. It requires us to demonstrate that it occurred. You have a legal team, Varath Sond said. It was not quite an accusation. It was something closer to recognition. We have 40,000 years of charter analysis, I said. Yes. Varath Sond looked at me for a very long time. Outside, the fold event plasma had fully dissipated. The North Atlantic was a clear blue-gray below us, and if you knew where to look you could see the lattice running in its 4 orbital planes. the faint glint of 712 warships not announcing themselves but present, unmistakably present, in the quiet way that a prepared thing is present. Varathsan's scan systems would be reading them. The fleet commander would have updated its tactical picture the moment the communication link opened. It would know what was surrounding it. It had not asked about the warships. I found that interesting. "I want a demonstration," Varathsan said. "I expected you would," I said. "What parameters do you want to demonstrate against?" The Seeding Charter's Tier 4 assessment protocol includes a standard capacity verification battery, 43 tests. I would like to run the full battery against a representative sample of your active practitioners. How large a sample? 100 individuals. I can give you 1,000, I said, or 10,000, whatever the assessment protocol requires. I will also tell you in advance that I expect the results to trigger the Article 7 review on approximately 38 of the 43 tests. The remaining 5 tests are within your projected yield range, because those 5 tests assess capacities that your seeding protocol did not intend to develop, and that our 40,000 years of cultivation consequently have not prioritized. On the 38 that your protocol did intend to develop, we have exceeded your projected upper bound. The fleet commander of the Keth Dominion's proprietary recovery fleet sat with that for a while. In the archive, there are accounts from the handful of civilizations in the Dominion's historical asset portfolio that had survived their collection date in any form. Most had not, that describe the experience of facing Keth recovery operations. The accounts are not positive. The Keth were not brutal for its own sake, but they were utterly certain about their rights, utterly confident in their protocols, and absolutely unused to the idea that an asset world might have anything to say about what happened to it. That certainty was load-bearing for them. It was how they moved. It was how they had expanded for 200,000 years. What I was watching, across the holographic projection in the situation room of the Enduring Ledger, was that certainty encountering, for possibly the first time, an asset world that had read the fine print. "Run the first 10 tests," Varathsan said. We ran all 43. The concert coordinator brought 500 practitioners to active assessment status, and the charter executor's assessment drone, a different drone, a technical unit equipped with keth specification measurement arrays, ran the full battery over the course of 7 hours. I stayed in the situation room for all 7 hours. Voss brought me 2 cups of something that approximated coffee and 1 meal that I ate without tasting. The first 3 tests were individual perception assessments, practitioners in isolated chambers responding to calibrated signal noise, arrays that the Keth had designed to measure the lower bound of latency accelerant expression. The drone's measurement system reported results in a unit the archive translated as a Keth capacity coefficient. The projected upper bound for a Tier 4 seeding was a coefficient of approximately 2.8. Our first 3 practitioners came back at 91.4, 88.7, and 103.2. I watched the charter executor receive those figures, and I watched it consult with its instruments for a long time before it said anything. When it finally spoke, it said, "Please confirm that the test subjects have not been pre-selected for exceptional performance." "They were selected at random from the active ready roster," I said. "I can provide the selection log if it would assist the assessment." The charter executor consulted its instruments again. "Proceed to Test 4. Tests 4 through 10 were projection assessments. The ability to interact with engineered signal arrays through deliberate output rather than passive reception. The Keth had designed these tests to capture a yield's operational utility. A practitioner who could only receive was interesting, but a practitioner who could also project was the actual resource. Our results on tests 4 through 10 ranged from 32 to 61 times the Tier 4 projected maximum. By test 11, the charter executor had stopped making requests for log confirmation and started running the assessments in silence. The most revealing moment came at Test 22. This was a test the archive had flagged as significant. The keth called it the coherence battery, and it was designed to measure the degree to which a practitioner's signal output degraded under stress. The Dominion's intended use for high-yield practitioners involved operating in contested, high-interference environments, and a yield that performed beautifully in a quiet chamber but fell apart under pressure was not worth what the collection cost. Test 22 applied a carefully calibrated interference field, keth standard disruption frequencies, and measured how much the practitioner's output degraded in response. The projected Tier 4 result was a 60 to 70% degradation under standard interference. A well-trained yield might hold it to 40%. The Dominion considered anything below 30% exceptional. Our 500 practitioners held an average degradation of 3.1%. The charter executor was silent for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I was watching the clock. Then it said, "The interference field is functioning correctly." "I can provide you with the field calibration logs," I said. "Please do." I sent the logs. The drone confirmed the interference field had been running at standard keth parameters throughout. The charter executor reviewed the confirmation and said nothing further, and we proceeded to test 23. The results came back test by test, and test by test, they were what Ray and Albrecht had told me they would be. The first 10 tests came back at between 32 and 61 times the Tier 4 projected maximum. The next 15 came back between 40 and 88 times. By the time we reached the 38th test, a cooperative signal projection battery that the keth had designed to assess capacity for synchronized group operation, which was the specific capacity they valued most, because it was the one that made a yield transferable to Dominion operations rather than merely individually impressive. The result was 112 times the projected upper bound. The assessment drone transmitted the results to Ascendant Yield and went quiet. Verathsond came back on the communication link 40 minutes later. The scoring on its thorax looked no different, but something in the set of its body had changed. I had spent 9 years studying the archive's analysis of keth body language, and I knew what I was seeing. An entity that had arrived with a map and discovered the territory did not match it. "The assessment results are anomalous," Verathsond said. "They are consistent with what I described in the Article 7 notification," I said. "They are anomalous relative to your projected yield. They are not anomalous relative to our operational baseline. The cooperative synchronization results in particular." A pause. Test 38. 112 times upper bound. That figure implies a population-scale synchronized operation capacity. Yes, the Threshold program runs population-scale synchronization exercises twice a year. The current concert pitch has been maintained for the last 12 hours without strain. We have approximately 5,100 practitioners in active ready state right now, which is about a third of our Tier 1 operational capacity. Silence. "Fleet Commander," I said, "I want to be clear about what I am not saying. I'm not saying that Earth is a military threat to the Keth Dominion. I am saying that designation TERTIUS has developed a capacity that is categorically different from what the seating charter anticipated, in ways that trigger Article 7's mandatory review provisions, and that under those provisions the reclamation protocol as originally drafted cannot lawfully proceed. I am asking the Dominion to engage with that procedural reality, nothing more. And if I do not accept the Article 7 invocation..." I had prepared for this question. I had been preparing for it in various forms for 9 years. "Then we have a disagreement about the interpretation of your own charter," I said. "And I would note that a disagreement of this kind between a recovery fleet and an asset world that has exceeded Tier 4 specification by the margins the assessment battery just confirmed is precisely the situation Article 7 was designed to address. The Dominion wrote that article for a reason. I am asking you to honor it. Verathsan was still for a long time. Then it said, I will need to consult with Dominion legal authority. This matter is outside my operational discretion. I understand completely, I said. We will hold at current status while you consult. There is no urgency on our end. That last sentence was the most important thing I said in the entire exchange. Not a threat, not a demonstration of force, just a calm, factual statement about the temporal relationship between us and the situation. We were not in a hurry. We had waited 72,000 years. We could wait as long as the Dominion needed. The communication link went dark again. The consultation took 9 days. In those 9 days, the Keth fleet did not move. It held position at 400 kilometers, running continuous scans that we read and logged and occasionally annotated for the archive. The fleet scan pattern shifted on day 3 to begin capturing detailed imagery of the orbital infrastructure, the lattice, the warship deployment, the veil array, and I authorized the lattice to remain in passive mode and the warships to maintain minimal emission profiles throughout. Let them look. Let them build the complete picture. That was fine. A complete picture was better for everyone than a partial one. On day 2, I took a shuttle down to the surface for a briefing with Kasha Drent and the legal team. It was the first time I had been on the ground in 4 months. The shuttle dropped through the veil array and the cloud layer and came in low over the eastern seaboard infrastructure, and I sat at the viewport and watched the megalopolis slide past. The stacked transit corridors at altitude, the towers that registered on Keth scans as industrial, and were, of course, also defense installations and also residences and also concert facilities and also archives and also 100 other things. Because that was how you built a civilization that was preparing for something. You built everything to serve more than one purpose. You did not have the luxury of single-use infrastructure when you were building toward a day that might not come for another 30,000 years, and had to make the case for every budget cycle in between. Drent was waiting in the secure conference room with 5 members of her team, and a physical archive that occupied an entire wall printed documents, which she preferred for working, because she said that looking at physical paper made it harder to pretend that words were flexible. The documents on the wall were all related to Keth charter law, and she had been annotating them for 9 years in preparation for exactly this moment. They're going to accept the bilateral review, she said before I had fully sat down. The only question is on what terms. I know, I said. Walk me through your argument structure. What followed was 4 hours of the most detailed legal analysis I had ever sat through. Drent did not simplify. She moved through the Keth Charter protocols the way a surgeon moves through a familiar body, confident, unhurried, pausing only at the places where something interesting lived. The consent argument was the keystone, as she had always said it would be. The Keth had built their interstellar legal architecture carefully enough that it contained within it the means to challenge exactly what they had done, if you read it carefully enough, and if you were patient enough to build the challenge across 40,000 years of incremental archive work. They will try to separate the question of consent from the question of proprietary claim, Drent said. They will say, even if consent was improperly absent, the seating charter still establishes a legitimate interest that entitles the Dominion to some form of compensation or modified claim. Watch for that move. That is where they will try to find middle ground. And our response? Our response is that a claim built on a non-consent foundation is not a valid claim that can be modified. It is a void claim that can be reclassified. There is a difference between renegotiating a flawed contract and acknowledging that a contract was never valid. We want the second. We will accept nothing less than void. I thought about that. Is void achievable? Drent looked at me over the papers. It is achievable if we hold the line. It is achievable if we do not allow them to draw us into a discussion of modified terms before they have acknowledged the foundational problem. She paused. They will be patient. They are very patient people. They will try to normalize the negotiation, to make it feel like a commercial dispute between two parties who both have legitimate interests, because that is the frame in which they are comfortable. We must never accept that frame. We have the assessment results, I said. Yes. Those are important for a different reason. The assessment results are not, strictly speaking, the legal argument. The legal argument stands on the consent issue regardless of our capacity level, but the assessment results tell them what declining to engage with the legal argument would cost. They are the context in which the law operates. Make sure the context is clear. On day 4, the Coordination Office received a communication from a keth entity identifying itself as the Office of Proprietary Interests, Legal Division, which was, as best the archive could determine, one of the oldest continuously operating bureaucratic structures in the known galactic arm. It had been in continuous operation for over 300,000 years. It had managed the legal architecture of the Keth Dominion's seeding program for all of that time. It had never received an Article 7 invocation from an asset world before. This fact was stated in the communication, not as an accusation, but as context. The communication was long and formal and carefully worded, and our legal analysis team spent 2 days going through it before I sat down to respond. The core of it was this: the Office of Proprietary Interests acknowledged the formal validity of the Article 7 invocation based on the assessment battery results. It acknowledged that the departure from specification was real and was of a magnitude that required procedural review. It argued, however, that Article 7 contemplated renegotiation of charter terms, not nullification of the charter itself, and that the Dominion's position was that renegotiation should proceed on the assumption that the underlying proprietary relationship remained intact. In short, they were willing to talk. They were not willing to accept as a starting point that the charter was void. I thought about this for a long time. I discussed it with Voss, with Ray and Albrecht, and with the Coordination Office's senior legal director, a woman named Kasia Drent, who had spent 40 years in the archive and had a mind like a well-maintained instrument. Drent's position was that we should accept the renegotiation offer but make absolutely clear, in the first session, that our negotiating position was that the charter was void, not merely suspended, not merely subject to revised terms, but void on the grounds that the Keth's original seeding protocol had not obtained consent from the asset world, and that a contract entered into without the consent of all parties was not enforceable under any legal framework. The Dominion had itself codified, including the frameworks that governed how the Dominion handled disputes with other sovereign entities. The argument was elegant. The Keth had, in fact, codified consent requirements for contracts with other sovereign powers. They had done so because, over 300,000 years of interstellar commerce and treaty-making, they had found that non-consent contracts were difficult to enforce in practice. The seeding program had always operated under the assumption that asset worlds were not sovereign entities, and therefore consent was not required. Our position was that an asset world which had spent 40,000 years developing institutional self-governance and 40 millennia of deliberate capacity cultivation was, by any reasonable definition, a sovereign entity, and had been one long before the Dominion's recovery fleet arrived. We were not arguing that the Keth were evil. We were not arguing that they should be punished. We were arguing on their own terms in their own legal language, using their own precedents, that they had no valid claim. The first negotiation session took place on day 6 via communication link between Kasia Drent and the Office of Proprietary Interests lead counsel. It lasted 11 hours. I monitored the feed from the Situation Room and did not sleep. By the end of the 11 hours, the Keth Council had twice requested a recess to consult with superiors, and when it returned the second time, it was with a revised position that, while still maintaining the Dominion's nominal proprietary claim, acknowledged for the first time that the consent question required formal address. That was the crack in the wall. On day 7, the Keth Council tried to close the crack. It arrived at the day 7 session with a new argument that had not appeared in any of the previous communications, and I recognized it immediately as something that had been prepared at a level above the Office of Proprietary Interests. A legal framework advanced enough that it bore the marks of the Dominion's central jurisprudence body rather than its charter administration arm. The argument ran as follows: that the concept of sovereignty, as codified in Keth interstellar law, was defined by the capacity to enter into binding agreements with other sovereign entities. That entering into a binding agreement required, among other things, the demonstrated capacity to fulfill obligations under that agreement. That designation TERTIUS had, until 72,000 years ago, been a precontact world with no treaty relationships, no interstellar communication, and no capacity to enter into or fulfill interstellar agreements. That the Keth seating charter, therefore, had been enacted at a time when the asset world by definition lacked sovereign status, and that the sovereignty question was irrelevant to the validity of the charter as originally drafted. In short, you were not sovereign when we made the agreement, so the consent requirement did not apply then, and the charter, once validly enacted, could not be retroactively voided by a sovereignty status acquired afterward. Drent had been expecting something like it. She had told me on day 2 that the Dominion's legal team was good enough that they would eventually find this angle, and she had prepared the response across 400 pages of archival precedent. She said, "The Keth interstellar sovereignty framework also provides that a precontact world which subsequently achieves full sovereign status is, upon achieving that status, entitled to a retroactive review of any agreements or arrangements affecting its population that were enacted without consent prior to contact. This provision exists in the framework because the Dominion has, on 3 documented occasions in its history, incorporated precontact worlds into its treaty network and required a review of previous arrangements as a condition of the incorporation. The precedent exists. The provision exists. The Dominion wrote it. We are invoking it." The Keth Council requested a recess. It was gone for 6 hours. When it returned, it said that the Dominion acknowledged the existence of the retroactive review provision, but maintained that the provision applied only when the world in question was being formally incorporated into the Dominion's treaty network, which designation TERTIUS had not requested. "We are formally requesting it now," Drent said, "effective this session." Another recess, 2 hours. The Keth Council came back and said, "The Office of Proprietary Interests does not have the authority to process a formal incorporation request. That request would need to be forwarded to the Treaty Establishment Division." "Then please forward it," Drent said. "We will wait." There was a quality to the silence on the Keth side of the communication link during those 2 sessions that I found, in a way I had not expected, almost moving. The Dominion was not stupid. Its legal team was not incompetent. It had 300,000 years of practice at exactly this kind of dispute, and it was good at what it did. What was happening in those silences was not confusion. It was an experienced, sophisticated legal architecture encountering, for the first time, an asset world that had spent 40,000 years specifically preparing to engage that architecture on its own terms. Every angle the Dominion tried, we had a prepared response, not because we were cleverer than they were, because we had had 40,000 years to read everything they had ever written and prepare answers to every argument they might reasonably make. Patience, memory, preparation, discipline. The forwarding of the incorporation request to the Treaty Establishment Division changed the dynamic of the negotiation entirely. It was no longer a charter administration matter, a relatively minor category in the Dominion's bureaucratic hierarchy. It was now a treaty matter, which was a significantly higher priority category, and which involved a different set of offices and a different set of decision-makers. The Keth Council on Day 8 was noticeably different from the one on Day 6. Senior, more deliberate, with the careful manner of an entity that had been briefed thoroughly before arriving rather than learning the situation as it went. It widened over the next 2 days, session by session. The Dominion's legal position shifted from the Charter terms require renegotiation to the Charter's foundational premises require review to, on the morning of Day 9, something that I read 3 times before I believed it. A formal acknowledgement that the original seating protocol, as applied to designation TERTIUS, had been conducted without the knowledge or agreement of the affected population, and that this fact created a legal irregularity that the Dominion was prepared to formally address. A legal irregularity. 300,000 years of interstellar legal architecture, and that was the phrase they reached for. I accepted it. Language matters less than what it does. On the afternoon of Day 9, Fleet Commander Varath Sond requested a final direct communication with me, not through Council, not through the Charter Executor, the Fleet Commander personally. I sat down at the communication station, and the holographic projection filled the room again, and Varath Sond looked at me with those amber eyes that contained light rather than reflected it, and it said, "We will be departing the designation TERTIUS system within the next standard Keth day. The Office of Proprietary Interests will be in contact with your legal division to complete the formal void charter process. You will receive a copy of the final documentation through the official Dominion Communications Protocol." "I understand," I said. "We will be standing by for the documentation." "I want to ask you something," Varath Sond said. "Go ahead." 40,000 years. You found the Charter documents 40,000 years ago. You knew we would come back. You knew what we would come back for. A pause. And you spent 40,000 years preparing an argument. "Among other preparations," I said carefully. "The concert pitch," it said. "The 700 warships in the orbital lattice. Yes, I know about those. I have known about them since Day 1. I was not going to raise them because I did not believe they were the point." I looked at the fleet commander of the Keth Dominion's proprietary recovery fleet, 9 days into a mission it had expected to complete in 4 hours, and I said, "They are not the point. You are correct. The argument is the point. The warships are what happens if the argument fails." Varath Sond was quiet for a moment. "They are impressive warships." "We had a long time to build them," I said. Another pause. Something in the set of the fleet commander's armored body was different from the first time it had looked at me through that projection. Not diminished. Something more complicated than diminished. The archive had a word for it, a Keth word that translated approximately as the sensation of recognizing, retroactively, that a situation had been significantly different from what it appeared to be. I had read that word hundreds of times in the archive. I had not expected to see it illustrated in real time. "The argument was sufficient," Varath Sond said. "I know," I said. "It was always going to be sufficient. We made sure of that." The communication link closed. The Keth fleet began its departure sequence 6 hours later. We tracked it through the Veil Array and the lattice's passive systems as it pulled back to the fold boundary threshold, a clean and unhurried withdrawal at a speed that communicated neither panic nor humiliation. The Keth, to their credit, were precise in everything they did. They had arrived precisely and they left precisely. Ascendant Yield's fold event opened at 03:47 ship time and lasted for 32 seconds, and then the violet-white plasma disk was spreading again, and then it was fatting, and then the sky above the North Atlantic was empty in the way that a sky is empty when something very large has left it. Voss came to stand beside me at the viewport. I had been awake for 31 hours straight. I was aware of this fact in the way you become aware of physical conditions only when the reason you were ignoring them has been resolved. Drent's team is already working on the Void Charter documentation process, Voss said. She thinks it'll take about 8 months to complete. The Dominion's legal bureaucracy doesn't move fast. 8 months is fine, I said. We waited 72,000 years. We can manage 8 months. The concert coordinator wants to know when he can stand down from pitch. Tell Rayan he can stand down now, I said. Tell him the pitch held beautifully. I could hear something shift in the platform systems as the concert stand-down order propagated through the network. Nothing dramatic, no sound or vibration, just a change in the quality of attention in the building around me. 5,100 people taking a breath. I thought about all the people across the planet who had just stepped back from the edge of an extraordinary effort, and were now, in the very quiet way of people who have done the thing they trained for and found it sufficient, going about the rest of their day. I thought about Thessaly Vaughan asking her question. I thought about the 14 funding crises and the 14 reinstatements. I thought about the generations of practitioners and archivists and legal scholars and concert coordinators who had built this toward a day they would not personally see, because that is how you prepare for something that arrives in 72,000 years. You build institutions that outlast you, and you trust them to hold. They had held. Voss was watching me. "Go get some sleep, Sollies," he said. "I will," I said, "in a minute." I stayed at the viewport a little longer, watching the sky above the Atlantic where the Keth fleet had been. The orbital lattice was still up there, the 700 warships in their 4 orbital planes, the veil array lacing the upper atmosphere in frequencies no Keth instrument had been designed to read. They would stay up there. Not because the Keth were coming back. I did not think they were coming back, but because that was what you did when you were a civilization that had learned over a very long time that the memory was the thing. The memory and the discipline and the patience and the work. We had not won because we were stronger than the Keth. We might be, eventually, but that was beside the point today. We had won because we had refused, for 40,000 years, and in the face of every uncertainty and every funding crisis, and every generation that could not quite see why it mattered to prepare for something none of them would live to face. We had refused to forget what had been done to us, and we had done the work. That was the thing I wanted to remember about today. Not the assessment battery results, not the moment Verath Sond acknowledged the legal irregularity, not the fold event opening and the fleet withdrawing. The thing I wanted to remember was that it had been sufficient. 40,000 years of preparation, and it had been exactly as sufficient as the people who built it had intended it to be. I turned away from the viewport and went to find something to eat, and then to sleep for as long as I needed to. Outside, the sky held everything we had built, quiet and ready and waiting, the way it always had.